16 years. That's how long Vivian DeLuca stood beside the most dangerous man in Chicago. Loyal, devoted, unbreakable. Then one night, a single glance across a crowded room tore everything apart. Her husband wasn't just having an affair. He was erasing her, freezing her accounts, destroying her name, throwing her out of her own home like she was nothing. But Massimo DeLuca made one catastrophic mistake. He forgot that the woman who helped him build his empire knew exactly where he buried his secrets. If you've ever been betrayed by someone you trusted with your life, this story is for you. Watch until the very end, hit that like button, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The night it all fell apart smelled like money and French perfume, and something underneath both of those things that Vivian couldn't name until much later. Until she was standing in a diner at 2 a.m. scrubbing grease off a flat-top griddle and finally had enough quiet to call it what it was. Rot. The whole evening had smelled like rot. She hadn't wanted to go to the Beaumont Gala. She rarely wanted to go anywhere Massimo insisted on anymore, but 16 years of marriage to a man like him had taught her the difference between battles worth fighting and ones that would only cost her standing in a war she wasn't yet ready to wage. So she'd put on the black Valentino he'd bought her for their 14th anniversary, the one that still fit perfectly, because she still went to the gym every morning at 6, even though she hadn't slept past 4 in months. And she'd let the stylist pin her dark hair up in that severe way Massimo preferred, and she'd gotten into the back of the armored Escalade without a word. The Beaumont was a 40-floor hotel on Michigan Avenue that charged $1,200 a night for rooms that faced the lake. The gala occupied the entire top floor, a ballroom that held maybe 300 people and had been designed to make all 300 of them feel like they were standing inside a jewelry box. Vivian had attended this event 11 times. She knew the bartenders by name. She knew which city councilmen had gambling problems and which federal judges had mistresses and which police captains took cash in envelopes left in the bottom drawer of the courtroom lockers. She knew these things because Massimo had told her, early in their marriage, when he still believed that a wife who understood the machinery was more useful than one who didn't. He'd stopped telling her things around the time she'd started asking questions he didn't like. She stood near the east windows with a glass of Sancerre she wasn't drinking and watched the room work itself into the performance it always became within the first hour. Politicians shaking hands they'd later deny shaking. Business partners laughing too loudly at each other's jokes. The city's legitimate face and its criminal skeleton occupying the same space, wearing the same clothes, speaking the same careful language. Massimo was in the center of it all the way he always was. The gravitational center, the point everything else orbited, talking to 3 men in suits whose combined net worth probably exceeded the GDP of a small nation. He was laughing. He had a beautiful laugh. She'd fallen in love with that laugh a long time ago, before she understood what it cost people when it stopped. She noticed Serena Voss the way you notice something that doesn't quite belong. Not because Serena was out of place exactly, but because Vivian had learned over years of navigating rooms like this one to catalog what was new. Serena was new. She was maybe 32, 33, with the kind of polished, angular beauty that photographed well and announced itself without apology. Dark blonde hair, a dress the color of champagne, a posture that said she'd been trained to be looked at and had decided to make looking at her cost something. Vivian clocked her as an attorney before anyone introduced her. It was in the way she held her drink and her space simultaneously, in the way her eyes moved across the room in a pattern that was assessing rather than social. She was Massimo's new legal advisor. He'd mentioned her exactly once, in passing, 2 months prior, the way you mention something you want to establish as ordinary. Serena Voss, excellent record, came highly recommended. Vivian had filed the information away without attaching significance to it, because she'd been filing things away without attaching significance to them for years, which was its own kind of survival. What happened next took maybe 4 seconds. Massimo finished whatever story he was telling the 3 suits, and his head turned, just slightly, just enough, and found Serena across 40 feet of crowded ballroom floor. It wasn't the look of a man scanning a room. It wasn't the look of an employer checking on a subordinate. It was the look of a man who knew exactly where something he wanted was located. And the wanting was so practiced, so already settled, that it sat on his face without any of the nervousness or restraint that might have made it ambiguous. Serena looked back, and in the half-second before she rearranged her expression, Vivian saw something she recognized. The particular softness that a face does when it's looking at someone it has already let in. 4 seconds. That was all it took. Vivian looked down at the Sancerre in her hand and noticed that her knuckles had gone white around the stem of the glass. She set it down on the windowsill very carefully, the way you set down something you're afraid you might break by accident or throw on purpose, and she took a slow breath and did not allow her face to do anything at all, because the room was always watching, and the one advantage she had left was that no one in it knew what she now knew. She stayed for another hour and 15 minutes. She talked to the mayor's wife about a new restoration project at the Chicago Cultural Center. She talked to a shipping magnate named Aldrich Fenn about his daughter's acceptance to Northwestern, and she was warm and interested and present in the way she'd learned to be in rooms where warmth and interest were currency. She touched Massimo's arm twice in moments calculated to look like affection. He didn't flinch. He was too controlled for that, but she felt the slight recalibration in his posture, the almost imperceptible way he registered her touch as an interruption. On the drive home, he told her he had a midnight call with an international partner and would likely be in his office until 3. She said that was fine. She'd been tired anyway. He nodded and looked at his phone and said nothing else for the rest of the 40-minute drive. She went upstairs. She changed out of the Valentino and hung it with the precision of a woman who knew she'd need to think clearly about what came next. She sat on the edge of the bed in the dark for 11 minutes. She knew because she watched the clock. And then she got up, because sitting still had never once in her life solved anything, and she went to the window that faced the private garage. The armored Escalade was still there. So was the silver Mercedes that Massimo used when he wanted to be less visible. As she watched, it backed out of the garage, headlights off until it cleared the gate and turned north instead of south. North, away from the DeLuca Group's downtown offices, toward the residential towers on the Gold Coast. She stood there a long time after the taillights disappeared. The thing about realizing your husband is having an affair is that it first presents itself as a wound, specific, personal, located somewhere in the chest cavity where the architecture of trust used to live. And for maybe 2 minutes, standing at that window, Vivian DeLuca allowed herself to feel that. The loneliness of 16 years suddenly arranged differently. The hundreds of small concessions that had seemed like the natural grammar of a long marriage recontextualized into a pattern she hadn't let herself read clearly. The way he'd stopped asking her opinion on things. The way he'd moved 2 of her longtime assistants off his accounts without explanation. The way he'd had his attorney revise her access to 3 of the joint holdings 6 months ago and told her it was routine restructuring. It wasn't a wound. It was an architecture. It was a plan. Vivian DeLuca was not a woman who cried in moments of crisis. She cried at other things, old films, certain kinds of rain, the particular silence that settles after a hard conversation. But not this. Instead of crying, her mind went very quiet and very fast, the way it had when she was 19 and working her way through a statistics program at UIC on financial aid and sheer stubbornness, the way it had in the first years of building the DeLuca Group's legitimate face from a shell company and a pile of cash that needed cleaning. Massimo had married her for that mind. He'd spent 16 years forgetting it still worked. She went to the small safe in her study, not the one Massimo knew about, but the second one built into the back wall of the closet behind a panel that matched the wainscoting so precisely that 3 different contractors had missed it. She opened it and took out a prepaid phone she'd purchased 8 months ago at a gas station in Evanston, paying cash, wearing a baseball cap, because somewhere in the reptile part of her brain where the self-preservation instincts lived, she'd understood that a day like this was probably coming. She'd just hoped she was wrong. She wasn't wrong. She turned on the phone and sat in the dark study with it in her hand for a long time, thinking about the choices laid out in front of her. She thought about them the way she thought about everything important, methodically, stripping out the emotion until she could see the structure underneath. She had maybe a narrow window. She understood that much. A man like Massimo didn't make plans halfway, and if he was already moving assets and isolating her legal protections, she was already behind. She needed an attorney, not one of the dozen attorneys who kept offices in the DeLuca Group's Michigan Avenue building and owed Massimo favors going back a decade. someone from outside the ecosystem, someone who knew criminal law and wasn't afraid of what knowing it in this context would cost. She'd heard the name Roman Mercer twice in the past 2 years, once from a federal prosecutor's wife at a charity dinner who'd mentioned him with the particular mixture of admiration and wariness you reserve for someone who's beaten you in court, and once from Massimo himself, who had referred to Mercer as a pain in his ass in the specific tone he used for people he took seriously. That was all the recommendation she needed. She didn't call him that night. She wasn't ready yet, and making contact before she was ready would be wasting the only element in this situation she actually controlled, which was information. Instead, she sat in her study until nearly 4 in the morning, moving through what she knew and what she needed to know, and what she'd have to do to close the gap between them. When she heard the Mercedes pulling back into the garage, 2:47, she noted, just over 2 hours, not a business call, she turned off the prepaid phone and went back to bed and lay in the dark with her eyes open and her breathing controlled. And when Massimo came in and undressed in the bathroom and got into bed on his side and said nothing at all, she said nothing back, and they lay there 8 inches apart in an enormous bed in a mansion on the north shore of Chicago. And Vivian thought, you have no idea what you've just started. She was up at 5:45. She made coffee. She brought Massimo a cup the way she always did. The ritual of a long marriage, the small domestic choreography that meant something once and now meant nothing except that she was still playing the role she'd been assigned, for now. He took it without looking up from his phone, and she went back to the kitchen, and she ate a piece of toast standing at the counter, and she thought about Serena Voss's champagne-colored dress, and Massimo's face across the ballroom, and the silver Mercedes going north without its headlights. And she thought, what did Serena Voss know that Vivienne didn't? Because here was the thing about Massimo DeLuca that most people in his orbit eventually learned too late. He didn't involve civilians in strategy. If Serena was his legal advisor and also his mistress, that wasn't sentiment, that was utility. A woman in Serena's position, with access to Massimo's legal documentation and the intimate trust of a man who normally trusted no one, would know things, would have seen things, might even, if she was smart or scared or both, have recorded things. A woman like that was either a liability to Massimo or a resource for Vivienne. Maybe, in the right circumstances, both. 3 days passed. Vivienne maintained the surface of their life with the precision of someone diffusing a device they couldn't yet see clearly. Breakfast, the twice-weekly dinner parties, the organizational work she still did for 2 of the DeLuca Group's legitimate charity arms. She listened carefully and spoke less than usual and watched for the signs of what was coming, the way an animal reads the weather before it breaks. On the 4th day, she drove herself to a coffee shop in Logan Square, far enough from their world that no one she knew was likely to walk in, and she called Roman Mercer's cell phone from the prepaid. He picked up on the 3rd ring. His voice was flat and a little impatient, the voice of a man accustomed to calls that wasted his time. Mercer. My name isn't something I'm going to say on this call, she said, but I'm the wife of someone you've described as a pain in your ass, and I have information that would be considerably more than that to the right people. A pause. She could hear him thinking. How'd you get this number? I'm resourceful, she said. That's the first thing you should know about me. Another pause, shorter. Where are you? She told him the coffee shop. He said he'd be there in 40 minutes. He was there in 32, which told her something useful about his level of interest. He was shorter than she'd expected, compact, with a boxer's economy of movement and eyes that were doing the same cataloging assessment hers were. He sat down across from her, didn't offer his hand, and looked at her for a moment. You're Vivian DeLuca, he said, not a question. I said I wasn't going to use names. I recognized you. Your picture's been in the Tribune 3 times in the past 18 months. Charity work. He said the last 2 words with a particular neutrality that wasn't quite contempt, but wasn't far from it either. It was real work, she said. I don't need you to believe that right now, but I'm telling you because it's true, and because I'm not in the habit of lying to people I'm about to trust with my life. He held her gaze for a moment, then nodded once, a small, economical acknowledgement. Tell me what you have. She told him about the gala, about the silver Mercedes, about the legal restructuring and the frozen access to accounts she'd discovered when she'd tried to move money 2 days prior for a routine charitable disbursement, about the pattern of the past 8 months viewed in retrospect, the specific and systematic way she'd been having her legal and financial standing quietly undermined without her noticing because she'd been extending the benefit of the doubt past the point where it was reasonable. Roman listened without interrupting, which she appreciated. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. He had his hands flat on the table and he was looking at them instead of at her, and then he looked up. "He's moving to divorce you, and he's pre-positioning the assets," he said. "That's the civil piece. But you said you have information. You mean beyond what you've just told me." "I mean that if Serena Voss has been involved in his legal strategy and his personal life simultaneously, there's a high probability she has documentation she shouldn't have shared and may have held on to for her own protection. Attorneys do that sometimes when they're smart and scared. They keep receipts." Roman studied her. "What makes you think she's scared?" "Because the man she's sleeping with controls this city's criminal infrastructure and has done it for 20 years without significant legal exposure. And if she's been his attorney, she knows things that make her both his most valuable confidant and his most dangerous liability. Any woman with a functioning brain in that position keeps receipts." She paused. "I kept receipts." "You did?" "For 8 years, not because I was planning to use them, because I understood the environment I was living in." She kept her voice level. "The question is whether what I have is enough, or whether what Serena Voss has is better." Roman put both palms on the table and leaned back slightly, and she watched the calculation running behind his eyes. "This is going to get very bad before it gets better," he said. "You understand that?" "Yes." "He has resources that I don't. He has judges, he has lawyers, he has people who will make your life unrecognizable." "I know." "If we pursue this and we can't make it stick, then I'll have lost," she said. "I know the odds, Mr. Mercer. I've been living inside them for 16 years. I'm asking you if you want to help me change them." He was quiet for a long moment, then, "I'll need everything you have, every document, every communication, every financial record you can access." "I've already started compiling." The corner of his mouth moved. Not a smile exactly, but the precursor to one. "You started before you called me." "I told you," she said. "I'm resourceful." Outside the coffee shop, the Chicago October cold was pressing its hands against the glass. A delivery truck blocked the intersection at the corner, and its driver was arguing with someone in a parked car, the kind of small friction that the city generated constantly, all its pieces grinding against each other. Vivienne watched the argument for a moment and then looked back at Roman Mercer, and she thought about the expression on Massimo's face at the gala and the silver Mercedes without its headlights and the 16 years of architecture she'd been living inside without ever seeing the whole blueprint. She wasn't crying. She wasn't even angry, exactly. Or rather, the anger was there, but it had been converted into something more useful. The way you convert raw materials into the thing they were always supposed to become. She was clear. She was focused. She was already 3 moves ahead of where she'd been 4 days ago, and she wasn't close to finished moving. She didn't know yet what Serena Voss had on a backup drive in a cloud account she'd accessed from her personal laptop 3 times in the past month. Access logs that Vivienne would eventually obtain through means that Roman would later describe in court as aggressively legal. She didn't know yet that those backup files contained something far more dangerous than evidence of an affair. She didn't know yet that the night the silver Mercedes went north, Massimo hadn't just been with Serena. He'd been on a phone call logged to his personal device in a moment of extraordinary carelessness, the carelessness of a man who'd gone too long without consequences. A call in which he'd discussed, in specific and damning detail, the arrangement he'd made 6 months prior with a warehouse owner on the south side. An arrangement involving fire accelerants and a falsified inspection report and an insurance payout of $12 million and a judge whose rulings had been available for purchase for the better part of a decade. She didn't know any of that yet. She just knew she'd started, and that starting was the thing that mattered, and that Massimo De Luca had spent 16 years forgetting the woman he married still had teeth. She was about to remind him. 4 days after her meeting with Roman Mercer, Vivienne came home from what she'd told Massimo was a lunch with the Women's Foundation Board to find 3 men she didn't recognize in her foyer, along with a man she did. Gerald Payne, one of Massimo's senior attorneys, holding a manila envelope with the particular expression of a man performing a distasteful task with professional detachment. "Mrs. DeLuca," Payne said, "I need you to review these documents." The documents were a temporary restraining order, signed by the Honorable Warren Caulfield of the Cook County Circuit Court, citing documented incidents of erratic and threatening behavior on Vivienne's part that she had never exhibited and could not have exhibited because they had never occurred. There was a certified letter from Massimo's primary financial manager, informing her that the accounts had been frozen pending the outcome of divorce proceedings. There were 2 men, not the ones in the foyer, 2 others who had materialized from somewhere near the kitchen, who were, Payne explained, there to facilitate her departure from the premises, which she was required to vacate within 4 hours under the terms of the order. Vivienne stood in her own foyer and read the documents twice. She was aware of the men watching her, and aware that her pulse had climbed, and aware that there was a specific and targeted humiliation built into this: the audience, the 4-hour window, the language in the TRO about erratic and threatening behavior, designed not just to remove her from the house, but to establish a narrative that would precede her everywhere she went after she left. She looked at Gerald Payne. "You should be careful," she said, "about the company you keep." He looked at the floor. She went upstairs. She packed 1 bag, one deliberately because she was not going to give anyone the satisfaction of watching her struggle with luggage. And she took the specific things she'd already identified as important, and she left everything else. She walked back through her own house one time, not slowly, not theatrically, just once, the way you walk through something before you close the door on it. Then she walked out. She was in a motel in Pilsen by 9 that night. She opened the prepaid phone and sent Roman Mercer a text with 3 words. They moved early. Then she sat on the edge of a motel bed with the bag at her feet and the thin light of the room making everything look the color of old paper, and she was quiet for a while, and then she opened her laptop and went back to work. The motel in Pilsen smelled like cigarette smoke and old carpet cleaner, and the particular staleness of a room that had housed 100 different kinds of desperation before hers. Vivienne sat at the small desk with her laptop open and the prepaid phone beside it and a cup of gas station coffee going cold at her elbow, and she worked. That was the thing about her that Massimo had always underestimated, even when he was using it. She worked. Not the performative busyness of a woman trying to appear useful, but the specific, methodical, head-down labor of someone who understood that problems didn't have feelings about being solved. They just waited for the right application of pressure. It was past midnight. The room cost $48 a night, and the lock on the bathroom door didn't catch properly, and the Wi-Fi signal came and went like a bad conscience. But none of that mattered, because what she needed was here. The files she'd transferred to an encrypted drive over the past week, the copies of financial documents she'd photographed with her personal phone over the past 3 months without knowing exactly why, the 3 years of emails she'd quietly forwarded to a private account that Massimo didn't know existed. Receipts like she'd told Roman, 8 years of them. Roman texted back at 12:40. "Saw. Where are you?" She gave him the motel name. He arrived at 1:15 carrying a paper bag from an all-night diner that had 2 coffees and a sandwich she didn't want, but ate anyway because she'd skipped dinner and her body was operating on adrenaline and stubbornness, and she understood she couldn't afford to let either of those run out. He sat in the room's single chair, and she sat on the edge of the bed, and they spread the contents of her encrypted drive across the desk between them, and Roman went through the documents with the concentration of a man reading a map in enemy territory. "TRO was signed by Caulfield," he said without looking up. "I know who Caulfield is." "Then you know he's been in Massimo's pocket since 2019. He turned a page. "This is going to be his tool to keep you from any emergency injunction to unfreeze your accounts. As long as Caulfield's on the bench for anything related to your case, you lose every procedural fight before it starts. Can we get him removed?" "On what grounds? Having a corrupt relationship with your estranged husband? I can raise it, but I need documented evidence, not inference. And the documented evidence is the thing we don't. He stopped. He was looking at something on the screen she'd opened to the financial records. What is this? Wire transfers, outgoing from a DeLuca Group subsidiary called Halcyon Asset Management to a holding company called Blue Meridian LLC. 3 transfers in a 14-month period. Total outlay of roughly $4.2 million. What's Blue Meridian? As far as I can tell, it doesn't exist in any meaningful way. It has a registered agent in Delaware, a P.O. box in Nevada, and a website that was built in 3 hours by a template service and hasn't been updated since it went live. Roman set the paper down. When did you find this? 7 months ago. He looked at her. You sat on this for 7 months. I sat on it because I didn't know what it was and I didn't want to move before I understood it. I still don't know what it is. What I know is that $4.2 million went to a shell company with no apparent business purpose, and that Massimo has never mentioned Halcyon Asset Management in my presence, which means he didn't want me to know it existed. Roman was quiet, turning this over. Money laundering is the obvious read, he said. But we'd need forensic accounting to establish the chain. That's federal territory. I'm aware. Going federal means this stops being a divorce case. It stopped being a divorce case the moment he filed a fraudulent restraining order against me with a bought judge, she said. I'm not interested in the divorce case, Mr. Mercer. I'm interested in what comes after it. He held her gaze for a long moment. Whatever assessment he was running on her, she let it run. Then he nodded and went back to the documents. They worked until 3 a.m. When Roman left, Vivian lay down on top of the motel bedspread without changing clothes and stared at the water-stained ceiling and let herself feel, for exactly 4 minutes, the full weight of what she was carrying. The humiliation of the foyer, the 3 men watching her pack, Gerald Payne in his manila envelope and his eyes on the floor. The bed in that mansion on the North Shore, 8 inches of distance that had been an ocean. 16 years. Then she sat up and opened the laptop again. The diner was called Cora's, 3 blocks from the motel, and it opened at 5:30 for the construction crews and the overnight shift workers, and the other people the city ran on who needed coffee and eggs before most of the city was awake. Vivian walked in on her second morning in Pilsen wearing her only casual clothes. Dark jeans, a gray sweater, running shoes that still looked expensive no matter what she paired them with, and asked the woman behind the counter if they needed help. The woman's name was Cora herself, which Vivian hadn't expected, and she was 61 years old and built like someone who'd spent decades on her feet and wasn't going to let anyone forget it, and she looked Vivian up and down with the frank assessment of a woman who could read a person's situation faster than most people could read a menu. You know how to work a griddle? I can learn. You ever waitressed? No. You look like you've never been in a diner in your life. I've been in plenty of diners. A pause. I've just never been on this side of the counter. Cora looked at her for another moment. $8 an hour plus tips. You work the 6 to 2 shift and you don't call in unless you're dead. You got a problem with any of that? No problem. What's your name? She hesitated for only a fraction of a second. Vivi. Vivi, Cora repeated in a tone that said she'd seen enough of the world to understand why someone might not want to use their whole name. You can start tomorrow. She started the next day. The work was hard in a physical way she hadn't experienced in years. Her feet ached by 9 a.m, her lower back staged a protest she had to ignore, and the rhythm of orders and plates and coffee refills and clearing tables required a different kind of attention than she was used to, a constant sensory awareness that left less room for the thoughts that had been running her in circles since the motel. In some ways, that was the most useful thing about it. Her hands stayed busy, and her body stayed exhausted, and the part of her brain that wasn't managing tables could work on other problems quietly, without the frantic edge that sleeplessness and displacement had been putting on everything. She was 3 days into the job when she walked back to the motel and found the door slightly ajar. She stopped in the hallway. The door was open maybe 2 inches, the security chain not engaged because she'd gone out without engaging it. Her own mistake, a lapse in the hypervigilance she'd been trying to maintain. She stood in the corridor and listened and heard nothing, and then pushed the door open with her foot and stayed in the doorway with her pulse working hard in her throat. The room had been searched, carefully, not ransacked, Not the theatrical mess of someone trying to intimidate, but turned over with a professional precision that left most things in their approximate locations, but disrupted enough to tell her someone who knew what they were looking for had been through her belongings. The laptop was still there. The prepaid phone was still there. The encrypted drive was in her jacket pocket, because she'd learned not to leave it anywhere she wasn't. But whoever had done this hadn't known about the drive. They'd been looking for something else. Paper documents, she thought. Physical evidence. Which meant Massimo was trying to determine what she had, and the fact that he was trying to determine it meant he didn't know. Which meant she still had the advantage she thought she had, just barely. She called Roman from the hallway without going back into the room. He was there in 20 minutes. He walked through the room without touching anything and then came back to where she was standing and said, "You need to move. Tonight." "I know. I have a place. It's not comfortable, but it's not connected to anyone in Massimo's network." "What is it?" "It's the back apartment in a building my sister owns in Bridgeport. She knows not to ask questions. It's got a working deadbolt and a back exit." She was in the Bridgeport apartment by 10 that night. Roman had been right. It wasn't comfortable. It was a studio with a futon and a folding table and a bathroom that needed regrouting, but it had 2 locks on the front door and a fire exit through the kitchen window that opened onto an alley, and it was clean and it was quiet, and no one knew she was there, except Roman and his sister, and Vivian chose not to think too hard about whether that was enough. On the 4th day in the Bridgeport apartment, Roman came by at noon with a coffee and his laptop and news. "Massimo's PR firm issued a statement this morning," he said, setting the laptop on the folding table and turning it toward her. "They sent it to 3 local outlets and 2 of the city blogs." She read it. It was 2 paragraphs. It described, in the careful, passive voice of professional damage control, concerns about Vivian DeLuca's mental health over the past several years, her erratic behavior at private events, her difficulty distinguishing reality from imagined grievances, the heartbreaking decision by her devoted husband to pursue a separation for the safety of himself and members of his household staff. She read it twice. She put the laptop down. "He's not wasting time," she said. "No, and 2 of his attorneys have already filed for an expedited hearing on the divorce. Caulfield is assigned." "Of course he is." "Vivian." Roman said her name in a tone that made her look at him directly. "The narrative he's building is designed to make everything you say sound like the output of an unstable woman who can't be believed. If we go into that courtroom right now with what we have, we lose. Not because the truth isn't on your side, but because the machinery of how a jury and a judge receive information is already being calibrated against you. So what do we do? We need something that can't be reframed, something objective. Audio, video, documents, something that exists independently of your credibility." She was quiet. She was thinking about what she'd said to him in the coffee shop in Logan Square, about a woman in Serena Voss's position keeping receipts. She was thinking about the specific expression on Serena's face at the gala, not the controlled professional face she'd worn for the room, but the half-second before she arranged it, the softness of someone who had let Massimo in. And underneath that softness, if Vivian was reading it correctly, something that looked a great deal like calculation. "I need to find out what Serena Voss has in her possession," she said. "We can't go near her. If Massimo finds out we've made contact," I'm not talking about contact, I'm talking about information. What do we know about her professional setup, her devices, her firm, how she manages client files? Roman looked at her for a moment. "I know someone who does digital forensics. Former FBI, now private. Very discreet. Call him." The digital forensics consultant's name was Dev Anand, and he arrived at the Bridgeport apartment 2 days later, carrying a bag that looked like it belonged to someone with a considerably more glamorous job and the energy of a man who genuinely enjoyed puzzles and had no particular feelings about what they contained. He was 45 and had the mild, unfocused manner of someone perpetually distracted until you said something that engaged his specific interest, at which point the mildness dropped, and he was suddenly very focused and very present. Vivian explained what she needed. Dev listened, asked 3 precise questions, and went to work. What he was doing wasn't illegal in the ways she tried not to think too hard about. He was analyzing publicly available metadata, cross-referencing device signatures with network access logs from Serena's firm's cloud provider, looking for patterns in backup timestamps and access locations that might indicate how Serena managed her personal files. It was the kind of work that existed in the gray zone between privacy and what privacy could reasonably be expected to cover when you were in the business of working for criminals. 3 days later, Dev called Roman. Roman called Vivian. Serena Voss has a personal cloud backup account, not her firm's system, a personal one she set up under a different email address. And she's been accessing it from her home network and from a laptop that's registered in the name of a family trust in her mother's name. She's backed up files to it 17 times in the past 18 months, with uploads that range from 200 kilobytes to 43 megabytes. The big uploads are almost certainly document files. Vivian sat with this for a moment. Can Dev access the account? Not without exposing all of us to federal hacking charges. But here's the thing. Roman paused, and she could hear the tension in it, the way someone sounds when they're about to say something they've been sitting with. One of those uploads, the largest one, happened 3 days after the Southside warehouse fire. The one in March that killed 2 workers and generated a $12 million insurance claim. The line went quiet. Vivian became aware of her own breathing. "Which warehouse?" she said, though she already had a feeling. "Kellerman Industrial Storage, South Halsted." The fire investigators' report listed cause as faulty electrical wiring in a substandard building, but 2 of the workers' families filed a civil suit claiming the inspection reports were falsified. The suit was dismissed by Judge Warren Caulfield 8 months ago. Caulfield. There it was, the thread that connected what she'd thought was Massimo's personal corruption to something that had killed 2 people and made $12 million disappear into entities like Halcyon Asset Management and Blue Meridian LLC. "She knows," Vivian said. "Serena was his legal counsel during the warehouse transaction. She knows what he did." "And she backed something up 3 days after it happened," Roman said, "which means either she was archiving her work product or she was scared," Vivian said. "And she was making sure she had something on him if she ever needed it." The silence stretched between them. "If that backup contains what I think it contains," Roman said carefully, "this isn't just a divorce case anymore. This is arson, insurance fraud, possible manslaughter, federal jurisdiction. Can we get to it legally? If we can compel Serena to turn over documents in discovery, and if we can establish that the personal backup account contains files relevant to Massimo's legal affairs that she managed as his attorney, yes, discovery is a tool, and Massimo's team doesn't know we know it exists. But Vivian," another pause. "If we compel Serena in discovery, we tip Massimo's team that we're looking in this direction. He will move to destroy evidence. He will move to destroy whatever she has. We have one shot at this, and the timing has to be right. Then we wait," she said. "We go into that courtroom for the divorce hearing, and we let him build his case, and we look like we're losing, and then we use discovery to pull what Serena has when his team isn't positioned to stop it. That means letting him win the early rounds." "Yes." "The press narrative, the TRO, the expedited proceedings, all of it." Her voice was steady. "I can take it." Roman didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "You're sure?" "I've been surviving that man for 16 years. I can survive a few more weeks of it." But the weeks that followed were harder than she'd expected, not because she hadn't prepared herself mentally, but because the lived experience of being publicly unmade was a different thing from its theoretical version. Massimo's PR campaign accelerated. A former household staff member, a woman Vivian had genuinely liked, a woman she'd personally advocated for when Massimo wanted to reduce the household budget 2 years prior, gave an interview to a local magazine describing Vivian's volatile moods and paranoid behavior, her tendency to make accusations without evidence, her history of monitoring Massimo's communications. The interview was constructed with the precision of a legal document. Nothing that could be definitively disproven, nothing that rose to outright defamation, everything calibrated to establish a particular kind of woman in the reader's imagination. Vivian read the interview at the folding table in the Bridgeport apartment at 2 in the morning, with Cora's griddle grease still on her forearms and her feet still aching, and the specific grinding exhaustion of a woman working a physical job on insufficient sleep in a studio apartment because her home had been taken from her by a corrupt court order. She read it twice. She set her phone face down on the table. She sat in the dark for a long time. Then she turned the phone back over and read it a third time, more slowly, making notes, because you couldn't respond to something you hadn't understood completely. And she was not going to let her understanding be colored by how badly this particular piece of it hurt. What she noticed, reading carefully, was that the former employee's quotes, while they tracked with Massimo's narrative precisely, contained two specific details that she could not have known if she had not been coached. Details about financial documents Vivian had reviewed in the private study, documents that the employee would have had no reason to observe, details that had the texture of something fed to her rather than remembered by her. Which meant the coaching had been careless, or whoever had written the lines hadn't thought about how closely someone reading for inconsistencies would look. She photographed the specific paragraphs and sent them to Roman with a message. Look at the 3rd and 7th quotes. What does she know that she shouldn't? Roman's response came 4 minutes later. I see it. That's our first documented instance of witness coaching. I'm adding it to the file. The divorce hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday in November, 6 weeks after the night Vivian had watched the silver Mercedes go north without its headlights. She wore a dark gray suit she'd bought from a resale shop in Lincoln Square for $32 because it was the right cut and the right color, and she had no intention of looking like a woman who'd been reduced. She sat beside Roman at the plaintiff's table, defendant, technically, since Massimo had filed first, and she looked straight ahead while Massimo's lead attorney, a man named Clifford Brandt, who billed $600 an hour and wore that fact in the particular hang of his suits, outlined the case against her character in a voice that never rose above a pleasant professional register. Massimo sat at the opposite table and did not look at her once. He was wearing a charcoal suit and an expression of measured sadness that she recognized as performance because she'd watched him put it on, over years, the way an actor warms up in the wings. He looked like a man in pain. He looked, she thought with a cold clarity, like exactly what he was trying to look like, which was a man who had been wronged by the person who should have been closest to him. She did not look at him either. Caulfield entered and the room stood and sat, and Vivian felt Roman shift slightly beside her. A small, barely perceptible movement that wasn't nervousness but was something adjacent to it. And she understood that they were about to begin the part they'd agreed to lose, and that losing it on purpose was still losing, and that it would cost something she didn't have a clear accounting of yet. Brandt called his first witness, a financial expert who'd been retained by Massimo's team, and who proceeded to characterize Vivian's access to the DeLuca Group accounts as irregular and potentially fraudulent, using language that was technically precise and substantively misleading in ways that would have been invisible to anyone without the background to parse it. Vivian watched the witness and listened, and wrote 2 words on the yellow legal pad Roman had in front of her. Fabricated timeline. Roman read it without looking at her and wrote beneath it, I know. The hearing ran 4 hours the first day. Roman cross-examined the financial expert in a way that was careful rather than aggressive, establishing inconsistencies without pressing hard enough to reveal how much he actually knew, laying groundwork without building the structure yet. She could see Massimo's team reading it as a weak response, saw the slight relaxation in Brandt's posture as the afternoon session ended that told her they thought they were winning without resistance. Good, she thought, let them think that. It was on the drive back to Bridgeport in Roman's car in the November dark with the city moving past the windows that he said, Dev found something else. She turned to look at him. In the metadata for Serena's backup account, the file she uploaded 3 days after the warehouse fire, he can't access the contents, but he found the access log for when the file was created, and it wasn't created 3 days after the fire. He paused. It was created the day of the fire, and it was accessed last week from an IP address in the Loop, her office building. Vivian processed this. She went back to it. She went back to it, Roman confirmed, which means she's thinking about it. She's either considering using it or she's scared that someone's going to find it. Can we approach her? Not directly, not yet, but he stopped at a light. The city was wet. a thin rain filming everything with reflected light. I think she may be trying to decide what side she's on, and I think if the right circumstances presented themselves, the right circumstances, Vivian said, if she knew that what's coming is coming regardless of her cooperation, that the question isn't whether Massimo goes down, but whether she goes down with him. Vivian looked out the window at the rain-slicked street. Somewhere across this city, Serena Voss was sitting with a decision she hadn't yet made, and on the other side of that decision was either everything Vivian needed or the end of any leverage she had left. The divorce hearing was going to drag on for another 3 weeks at minimum. Massimo's team was going to keep building their narrative, keep coaching their witnesses, keep leaning on the machinery of a corrupt system that they believed was entirely under their control. They didn't know what was in that cloud account. They didn't know that Dev had found it, or that Roman was already drafting the discovery motion that would compel Serena to turn over documents related to the warehouse transaction. They didn't know that Vivian had spent 3 weeks watching and waiting and absorbing losses she could survive, because she understood the difference between losing a round and losing the fight. And they didn't know, because Massimo had made the specific mistake of assuming that a woman he'd reduced to a diner job in a studio apartment with a bad lock was no longer capable of strategy, that Vivian had already made contact, not with Serena directly, but with someone who knew Serena, someone who had gone to law school with her, who still met her for drinks twice a month at a bar on Dearborn, who had called Serena 2 nights ago from a number Serena wouldn't recognize and said, very carefully, very precisely, that certain federal investigators were becoming interested in the Kellerman warehouse fire, and that anyone with documentation related to that matter might want to consider the difference between what it meant to come forward voluntarily and what it meant to be compelled. The call had lasted 4 minutes and 20 seconds. At the end of it, there had been a silence of 7 seconds before the line went dead. 7 seconds was a long time to be silent. 7 seconds was the sound of someone calculating odds, weighing the weight of what they were carrying against what it would cost to keep carrying it. 7 seconds was, Vivian thought, a woman deciding whether the man she'd bet everything on was still worth the risk. Vivian found out 3 days later that he wasn't. Roman called at 7:40 in the morning while she was tying her apron at Cora's, and she stepped out the back door into the alley with the November cold hitting her face like a flat hand, and he said 2 words before she could speak. She called. Vivian went very still. Serena called my office at 6 this morning and left a message, Roman said. She wants to meet. No attorneys present, no recording, just a conversation. She said she has something we need to see. The alley smelled like grease and wet asphalt and exhaust from the delivery trucks idling on the cross street. Vivian leaned against the brick wall and breathed through it. Where? She said. She named a coffee shop in Hyde Park. Tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock. She picked neutral ground. She picked somewhere Massimo's people don't go. That tells you something about where her head is. It told Vivian several things. It told her that Serena had been thinking about exposure long enough to know which parts of the city were safe. It told her that the 7 seconds of silence on the phone call had resolved into something actionable. And it told her this was the part that tightened something cold and specific in her chest, that Serena Voss was scared. Genuinely scared in the way that made people do things they'd sworn they wouldn't do, cross lines they'd convinced themselves were permanent. We go, Vivian said. Vivian, we go, Roman. Whatever she has is in that meeting. If we don't take the meeting, she talks herself out of it by Friday, and we lose the only opening we're going to get. A pause. Then, 8 o'clock. She went back inside and finished her shift without telling Cora anything, and she carried the information through 6 hours of coffee refills and short order plates and the specific grinding noise the griddle made when it needed cleaning. And when she got back to the Bridgeport apartment that night, she sat at the folding table in the dark and thought about Serena Voss making that call at 6 in the morning, which meant she'd been awake before 6, which meant she hadn't slept. Good. Sleepless people made honest decisions. Tomorrow, everything would change. The cloud backup, the warehouse, Caulfield, Blue Meridian, $4.2 million. All of it was about to come off the table where Massimo had arranged it so carefully and land somewhere he couldn't control. Vivian knew it the way she knew things that mattered. Not with certainty, but with the particular clarity of someone who has run out of room for doubt. She set her alarm for 5:30 and closed her eyes and did not sleep for a very long time. The coffee shop in Hyde Park was called Meridian, which Vivian noticed and filed away without comment, because the coincidence of the name was either meaningless or it wasn't, and she'd stopped believing in meaningless coincidences 3 weeks ago. It was a narrow place with exposed brick and mismatched chairs, and the kind of deliberately understated aesthetic that said the neighborhood valued substance over performance. At 7:50 in the morning, it was about half full. Graduate students, a few faculty types, a man in construction gear reading something on his phone. Nobody who looked like they belonged to Massimo. She'd arrived at 7:30 and taken a table near the back wall with a sight line to both the front door and the side exit, which Roman had raised an eyebrow at when she'd described her plan. She'd told him she wanted him outside, not in, visible from the street, but not in the room, because Serena had specified no attorneys, and Vivian understood that the terms of the meeting mattered less than the fact of it, but also that showing up in violation of stated terms would tell Serena something about how Vivian operated, and what she needed Serena to believe right now was that Vivian DeLuca was a woman who could be trusted to keep her word even when keeping it cost her something. She ordered black coffee and drank half of it and watched the door. Serena walked in at 8:03. She was wearing a coat Vivian didn't recognize, dark green wool, the kind of coat you buy when you're trying to look like someone other than yourself. And her hair was down instead of up, which changed her face considerably, made her look younger and more uncertain than the woman in the champagne dress at the Beaumont. She scanned the room, found Vivian, and came toward the table with the walk of someone who had made a decision and was now committed to it but hadn't yet stopped second-guessing the commitment. She sat down without taking off her coat. "You came alone," she said, looking around the room. "I said I would. People say things. I keep what I say." Vivian held her gaze. "Can I get you something? Coffee?" "No." A pause. Serena's hands were on the table, and she had the fingers of her right hand pressed flat against the wood in a way that looked deliberate, like she was using the table as an anchor. "I want to know what you know, before I say anything. I want to know what you actually have." "I know about Kellerman Industrial Storage," Vivian said. She kept her voice even and quiet, pitched under the ambient noise of the coffee shop. "I know about the fire in March. I know about the insurance claim. I know about Judge Caulfield and the civil suit dismissal. And I know that you backed up a file to your personal cloud account the day of the fire and accessed it again last week." The color in Serena's face shifted. It didn't drain exactly. It reconfigured, tightened in specific places, the way a face does when something it feared has been confirmed. "How do you know about the backup?" "Does it matter?" "It matters to me." "Metadata analysis," Vivian said. "Nothing that touched the file contents. We know it exists and we know the timing. We don't know what's in it." She let that sit for a moment. "But I think you're going to tell me." Serena looked at the table. Her right hand was still flat against the wood, pressing down. "If I tell you," she said slowly, "what happens to me?" "That depends on what you tell me and whether you're willing to testify." Testify. She said the word like it had a taste she didn't like. "Serena." Vivian waited until the other woman looked at her. "You called my attorney's office at 6 in the morning. That wasn't an accident, and it wasn't a casual inquiry. You called because you've been sitting on something that's become too heavy to carry alone, and you've realized that the man you've been carrying it for has a much cleaner exit strategy planned than you do. So I'll ask you one time directly, what is in that file?" The coffee shop moved around them, the espresso machine hissing, a chair scraping, someone laughing at the counter. Serena Voss sat very still in the middle of all of it and looked at Vivian with something that was past calculation now, past the professional assessment that had characterized every interaction between them at a distance. This was something rawer than that. This was a woman recognizing another woman who understood something specific about the cost of trusting the wrong person. "It's a recording," Serena said. Vivian didn't move. "An audio file. I recorded it on my phone during a meeting in Massimo's private office in February. 6 weeks before the fire. Serena's voice had dropped to something barely above the ambient noise. He was on a call with a man named Tate. I don't know a last name, I only ever heard the first name, and he didn't know I was still in the office. I'd come back for a document I'd left. The door to his inner office wasn't fully closed. She stopped. Her jaw tightened. He was describing the fire, not as something that had happened, as something that was going to happen. The accelerant placement, the timing, the workers' shift schedule. He knew there would be casualties. He said it was an acceptable cost. The room was very loud all of a sudden, or Vivian's perception of it had changed, the background noise pressing in differently. He knew people would die, Vivian said. He knew and he planned for it. He said the casualty element would support the narrative of faulty infrastructure, make the claim more credible. Serena's voice was steady in the way that voices are steady when the person speaking has rehearsed this in their head so many times the emotion has been worn smooth. I started recording about 90 seconds in. I have approximately 4 minutes of audio. He references the insurance claim amount. He references Caulfield by name and the arrangement for the civil suit. And he references... She stopped again. Her hand came off the table and went to her lap. He references a payment made to a building inspector named Drucker, who signed off on the falsified safety reports. Vivian sat back slowly. She was doing the math, not emotional math, practical math, the kind that told her what this recording meant in terms of charges, in terms of federal jurisdiction, in terms of what a prosecutor could build from 4 minutes of audio with corroborating documentary evidence about Halcyon and Blue Meridian and the wire transfers and Warren Caulfield. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. "Why didn't you go to the police in February?" she asked. Serena looked at her like she'd asked why she hadn't flown to the moon. "Because I was sleeping with him. Because I had taken money from 2 of his shell companies in consulting fees that I hadn't disclosed to the bar. Because I was afraid. And now? Now he's asked me to testify in your divorce proceeding about your mental state and your unstable behavior." Something moved across Serena's face, contempt or something that had curdled into contempt from another emotion. "He gave me a list of specific incidents to describe, things I never witnessed. He told me to tell the court I had observed them personally. He asked you to perjure yourself. He didn't use that word. He never uses that word. He said he needed me to be credible, and he told me what credible looked like." She pressed her lips together. "And I realized that I was next, that I was the thing he was going to use and then eliminate, the same way he was eliminating you. Except I knew too much for him to just freeze my accounts and file a TRO. The implication sat between them. "He wouldn't," Vivian said, though she knew as she said it that she was testing the statement rather than asserting it. 3 weeks ago, a man I've never seen before was sitting outside my building in a car for 4 hours. When I mentioned it to Massimo, he said I was being paranoid. Serena's eyes were steady now, past the fear into something colder. The same word he's using about you. Vivian looked at her for a long moment. She thought about the room in the motel that had been searched with professional precision. She thought about the specific and systematic way a person could be made to disappear from their own life before they were made to disappear in other ways. She thought about 2 workers on a night shift at Kellerman Industrial Storage who had gone to work on an ordinary evening in March and not come home. "I need the recording," she said. "I know. And I need you to testify, not just the file, you, in court, on the stand." Serena was quiet. "Without your testimony, the recording is a piece of evidence his attorneys will spend 6 months challenging the provenance of. With your testimony, it's a witness account corroborated by documentation, and it becomes the foundation for a federal case that doesn't need our divorce proceeding to succeed." Vivian leaned forward slightly. "Serena, he's already decided what he's going to do with you. The only question is whether you let him do it or whether you choose the timing yourself." The silence stretched long enough that Vivian could hear the specific rhythm of Serena's breathing. Controlled, effortful, the breathing of someone managing something they couldn't put down. Then Serena reached into her coat pocket and put a USB drive on the table between them. "The recording is on that," she said. "A clean copy. I have 2 others in separate locations." She looked at the drive, then at Vivienne. I'll testify. But I want to deal with the federal prosecutor before I take that stand. I want it in writing, signed, before I say one word in any courtroom. Roman can make that happen. How fast? Fast enough. Vivienne picked up the drive and closed her hand around it. The plastic was warm from Serena's pocket. Thank you. Serena looked at her with an expression that wasn't gratitude and wasn't its opposite. It was something more honest than either, the look of a woman who understood she was thanking the wrong person for the wrong reasons. Don't thank me. I'm doing this because I don't have a better option. I know, Vivienne said. That's all right. Sometimes that's enough. She called Roman from the sidewalk outside. He was parked half a block down and reached her in 45 seconds, which told her he'd been watching the door the entire time. She got in the passenger seat and held up the drive and said nothing. Roman looked at it and then at her face and said, "Is it what we needed?" "It's more than what we needed." She put the drive in her jacket pocket, the same pocket as the encrypted drive, both of them now against her ribs. "Get Dev to authenticate the file today and start drafting the federal approach. I want to be in front of a U.S. attorney's office by end of week." Roman pulled into traffic. The November city moved past the windows, gray and cold and indifferent. "The divorce hearing resumes Thursday," he said. "I know. Massimo's team is calling 3 more witnesses, 2 former employees and a psychiatrist they've retained who's going to testify about behavioral patterns consistent with delusional disorder." "Let them call them," she said. "Vivienne, let them build the whole thing. Let them stand it all up. Because when it comes down, I want it to come down in that courtroom, in front of Caulfield, in front of Massimo, in front of whatever press is covering the DeLuca divorce. I want him to watch it happen from 10 feet away." She looked out the window. "We have what we need. Now we need the moment." The moment, as it turned out, was 17 days away. And in those 17 days, 3 things happened that Vivienne hadn't planned for. The first was Dev's authentication report, which confirmed that the audio file on the drive was unedited, uncompressed, and carried metadata consistent with the phone Serena had used, which had been backed up to the cloud account and was therefore traceable to a specific device registered in Serena's name on a specific carrier with a specific account history. It was, Dev told Roman in the flat tone of a man who'd spent 20 years determining these things, about as clean as recorded evidence got. But it was the second thing Dev found that stopped Vivienne cold when Roman read it to her over the phone at 11 at night in the Bridgeport apartment. "There's a second file in the backup account," Roman said. "Smaller than the recording, about 200 kilobytes, so a document. It was uploaded 9 months ago, not 3 days after the fire. Dev couldn't access the content, but he found the file name in the metadata." "What's the file name?" A pause on Roman's end that lasted just long enough to tell her the answer was going to require her to sit down, which she was already doing. VH-DL-Trust-2019.pdf, Roman said. VH and DL are your initials and Massimo's. Trust and 2019. Vivienne stared at the wall of the apartment, the water stain above the window, the single bulb in its fixture throwing shadows that made the room look smaller than it was. "There's a trust document," she said. "A trust document Serena had in her possession for 9 months that she didn't mention this morning." Roman's voice was careful in a way that told her he was managing his own reaction to what he was saying, which means either it's routine estate planning work she handled in her capacity as his legal advisor, and it's not relevant, or he made changes to the trust that she documented and kept, and she didn't tell me because she's still deciding how much to give us. Vivienne pressed 2 fingers to the bridge of her nose. Or because she's using it as insurance, her own. We need to ask her about it. "I know," she breathed. "But we can't tip her that Dev found it, or she'll know the extent of our access and she'll renegotiate every term we've agreed on. We have to approach it as though we're asking a routine question about estate documentation as part of discovery. That's a thin line. Everything in this case is a thin line." She put the phone down on the table and sat in the near dark for a moment, recalibrating. The trust document. VH-DL. Her initials first, which was unusual. Estate trusts typically led with the primary holder. And in every document she'd ever seen relating to the DeLuca holdings, Massimo's name came first. Always. Unless the trust wasn't about Massimo's holdings, unless it was specifically about hers. She picked the phone back up. Roman. In 2019, Massimo and I restructured several joint holdings. I remember signing documents that I was told were routine revisions to our joint estate plan. I didn't read them as carefully as I should have. A pause. I need you to find out what I signed. The silence on his end had a different texture than the earlier one. This one was the silence of a lawyer hearing something that was rearranging his understanding of the case. How quickly can you get me any copies you have from that period? He said. By tomorrow morning. I'll start pulling Cook County filing records tonight. She didn't sleep. She went through the encrypted drive, every document she'd photographed and saved over the past months, looking for anything dated 2019 that related to estate or trust restructuring. She found 4 pages of a longer document, photographed in sequence, that she'd copied without fully reading because at the time she'd been looking for financial records of a different kind. She went through them now, line by line, and her legal comprehension was adequate. Not an attorney's reading, but 16 years of operating inside a sophisticated legal and financial ecosystem, both of them, dated November 2019, that reclassified 3 significant joint assets, including the primary DeLuca Group real estate portfolio, as separate property under Massimo's sole ownership, retroactively, based on a legal argument about original contribution that Vivian was certain was either fraudulent or had been obtained under conditions she hadn't understood at the time. She remembered signing something in November 2019. She remembered Massimo's estate attorney presenting it as a tax efficiency measure. She remembered being tired that month. They'd just returned from a 2-week trip to Europe that had been exhausting in ways she hadn't allowed herself to name. And she remembered signing because she trusted, still then, the architecture of the marriage she'd built. Her signature was on a document that had quietly stripped her of legal claim to 30% of the marital estate, and she hadn't known it for 5 years. She sat with this for a long time. The cold of the apartment pressed in around her. She could hear, distantly, the sound of a train on the elevated line, the mechanical rhythm of the city moving through its night. She thought about the specific patience of what Massimo had done, not the explosive aggression of the TRO and the frozen accounts. Those were reactive measures, panic moves when she'd started to become a problem. This was older than that. This was a man who had been planning the architecture of her removal from his life for years before she'd known she was a problem. A man who had looked at his marriage and calculated its useful lifespan and begun building the legal infrastructure of her erasure while she was still sitting across the dinner table from him, believing that whatever had gone wrong between them was fixable. The Trust Amendment. 2019. 7 years of the life she thought she'd had, running in parallel with the life he was actually building. She picked up the prepaid phone and called Roman. It was 2:40 in the morning, and he answered in the voice of a man who had not been sleeping either. The 2019 Trust Amendment strips me of the real estate portfolio, she said. I have 4 pages of it. I need the complete document. I found the Cook County filing 2 hours ago, Roman said. I've been trying to figure out how to tell you. Tell me what? Another pause, the third kind. The kind that was the sound of someone preparing to say something that would require the person hearing it to rebuild their understanding of something they thought they already understood. The Trust Amendment is dated November 2019, he said, but the Cook County recording timestamp in the digital filing system shows it was submitted for recording in August 2019, 3 months before the date on the document itself. A beat. Someone backdated it. Someone filed a document that claims to have been signed in November but was submitted 3 months earlier, which means it was prepared and filed before the signatures could have existed. The apartment was absolutely silent. Vivian heard her own pulse. It's a forged document, she said. It's a forged document that's been sitting in the Cook County records system for 5 years, and your signature on it is either forged or was obtained on a different document entirely and transferred. Vivian stood up from the folding table. She walked to the window and looked out at the alley, the wet brick walls, the single light above the fire door of the building opposite. She felt something shift in her chest that wasn't the wound she'd felt watching the silver Mercedes go north. This was different, This was the specific vertigo of discovering that the ground you'd been standing on was not what you'd thought it was, had never been what you'd thought it was. Massimo hadn't just planned to remove her from his life. He had been building a fraudulent legal foundation to do it for years, with the specific and patient intention of leaving her with nothing and no recourse. And the only thing standing between that intention and its completion was a USB drive in her jacket pocket and a woman who was still, even now, deciding how much of herself to trade for survival. "Roman she said. Her voice was very steady. She was surprised by how steady it was. "We need to move the timeline up. The federal meeting is Friday, Thursday, before the hearing resumes. I need to be in front of a federal prosecutor before Massimo's witnesses take that stand, because if the forged document surfaces in discovery after we've already lost the evidentiary phase of the divorce hearing, Caulfield will use it to cement the asset division and will spend 2 years in appellate courts trying to unwind something that should never have been wound in the first place." She turned from the window. "And I need to talk to Serena again, tonight if possible. It's 3 a.m. I know what time it is." She looked at the drive on the table, the 4 pages of forged trust document spread next to the laptop. "She has the full trust document in that backup account. She's had it for 9 months. She knew about the forgery, Roman. She may have been the attorney who prepared it." The silence this time was absolute. "If she prepared the document," Roman said slowly, "then she didn't just record Massimo discussing the warehouse. She's personally implicated in the fraud that's been used to strip your assets." "Which is why she came to us," Vivian said. "Not because she wanted to do the right thing, because she needed cover. She's been carrying evidence of her own criminal exposure, along with evidence of his, and she's been waiting to figure out which one to use and which one to bury." She pressed the heel of her hand against the table's edge. "She handed us the recording because she wants immunity for the warehouse. She didn't mention the trust document because she's hoping we won't find it." "What do we do?" Vivian picked up the USB drive and turned it in her fingers. The recording was on it. 4 minutes of Massimo De Luca describing, in his own voice, how to burn a building down with people inside it. That recording was going to walk him into a federal indictment regardless of what Serena had or hadn't disclosed. But the trust document, the forged document with her stolen signature, that was something else. That was personal in a way that the warehouse wasn't, in a way that cut beneath the criminal case and into something she hadn't expected to find, the specific and premeditated dismantling of the woman she had been inside that marriage, executed so quietly and so early that she hadn't felt it happening. She was not going to let Serena Voss trade that away for a reduced charge. "Set up the meeting," she said. "And Roman, when you talk to her, don't mention the trust document. Let her think we only have the recording. You want to let her walk into the conversation without knowing what we know. I want to see what she volunteers," Vivian said, "because what she volunteers will tell me whether she's an ally or whether she's just using us as her best available shield. And I need to know the difference before I put her on a witness stand in front of a federal judge." Outside, the elevated train ran again, the far, rhythmic sound of it cutting through the 3 a.m. silence of the city. Vivian stood in her small apartment with a forged document and a recording, and 16 years of a life she was finally seeing in its true dimensions, and she understood, with a clarity that felt almost physical, that the woman who had walked into that coffee shop in Hyde Park thinking she held the better hand had not been wrong. She had simply not yet understood how many hands were being played at the same table. The second meeting with Serena happened at 5:45 in the morning in the parking structure on South Michigan, Level 3, because Serena had picked it and Vivian had said yes without negotiating the location, which was itself a form of information. Serena wanted concrete and shadows and the ambient noise of a city waking up, wanted a place where a conversation couldn't be overheard in the way it could in a coffee shop with acoustics designed for intimacy. She was scared in a more specific way than she'd been in Hyde Park. The parking structure confirmed it. Roman dropped Vivian at the entrance and circled. She walked up the ramp with her hands in her coat pockets and her breath making small clouds in the cold, and found Serena on the far side of the 3rd level, standing beside a support column with her back to the wall in the instinctive positioning of someone who'd spent the last several weeks imagining threats from directions they couldn't see. Serena looked worse than she had 2 days ago. The sleeplessness was visible now. Not just in her eyes, but in the particular thinness of her face, the way exhaustion strips the surface off a person and leaves something rawer underneath. She was still in the green coat. She had her arms crossed over her chest. "Did you look at the recording?" she said before Vivian reached her. "Our technical consultant authenticated it this morning. And? It's clean, unedited, admissible." Vivian stopped 6 feet away, close enough to read her face clearly in the flat gray light. "We're meeting with the U.S. Attorney's Office tomorrow morning." Something moved through Serena's expression, relief and fear arriving simultaneously, which was the specific combination of someone who had wanted a thing and was now confronting what wanting it had cost. "I need to know what my exposure looks like," Serena said. "That's between you and the federal prosecutor." "I'm asking you." Vivian looked at her steadily. "The recording establishes Massimo's criminal intent in relation to the warehouse fire. Your possession of that recording and your willingness to testify about its origins is what transforms it from a piece of audio of uncertain provenance into evidence. The federal prosecutor will weigh your cooperation against your exposure. That's how it works." "What's my exposure?" "Serena." Vivian kept her voice level, kept it even, kept it completely devoid of the thing she was actually feeling, which was a cold and specific anger at the woman standing in front of her for the document she hadn't mentioned. "That depends on everything you were involved in, not just the recording. Everything." A silence. The parking structure amplified the distant sound of traffic, the structural creaks of the building adjusting to temperature. "I need you to ask me a specific question," Serena said. "All right." Vivian let the pause sit for exactly the right number of seconds. "Tell me about the trust amendment dated November 2019. The wall went up in Serena's face and came down in the same second. A flicker, almost too fast to catch, but Vivian was watching for it and caught it completely. There it was. The thing Serena had hoped they wouldn't find. "Where did you get that?" Serena's voice had changed register, lower, tighter. "The Cook County recording system," Vivian said. "It's a public record. What isn't public is that the filing timestamp predates the document's stated execution date by 3 months, which means someone prepared and filed a document that didn't yet exist based on signatures that hadn't yet been obtained." Serena said nothing. "I need to know if you prepared that document." The silence was 20 seconds long. Vivian counted them. The traffic below moved through its rhythms. A car entered the structure on level 1, and its headlights swept briefly across the concrete ceiling above them. "I prepared the initial draft," Serena said finally. Her voice was flat in the way that voices go flat when a person has decided to stop spending energy on the performance of composure. "Massimo told me it was a tax restructuring measure. He told me your signatures on the original 2019 estate planning documents constituted blanket authorization for the amendments. I filed it on that basis." "And the signature pages?" A longer silence. "He provided them," she said. I told myself the authorization was sufficient. I told myself it was within the scope of his instruction. I didn't look at the signature pages as closely as I should have." "But you knew," Vivian said. Not a question. Serena looked at the concrete floor. "I suspected. After the fire, when I realized what he actually was, I pulled the trust file and I looked at the signature pages and I knew they weren't right. The ink was wrong. The notarization was one I didn't recognize. I'd filed a fraudulent document." She pressed her lips together. "That's when I uploaded the backup." "You kept the trust document as insurance against Massimo." "I kept it because if it ever surfaced, I needed to be able to show that I'd identified the fraud and documented it. She stopped. "I needed it to not be my fault." Vivian breathed. The cold was settling into her fingers and she was aware of it distantly, the way you're aware of physical discomfort when something larger is occupying the foreground of your attention. She thought about what it would cost to use this information. The trust document, Serena's preparation of it, the filing fraud, against Serena. She could. Roman could build a case that implicated Serena so thoroughly in the asset fraud that any immunity deal for the warehouse testimony became contingent on Serena's full cooperation on the estate case as well. leaving Serena no leverage at all, no shelter, no independent survival strategy. She also thought about what it would cost Serena to go into federal court and testify about a man who had a car sitting outside her building for 4 hours. "Here's what's going to happen," Vivian said. "Tomorrow morning, you come with us to the U.S. Attorney's office. You bring the recording, you bring the full trust document, and you tell them everything you've just told me. All of it. Not the version that protects you, the actual version. And in exchange, Roman is going to advocate with the federal prosecutor for a cooperation agreement that acknowledges your role was substantially directed by Massimo's instruction and that your documentation of the fraud is evidence of your own recognition that it was wrong." Serena was looking at her now. "I'm not offering you clean hands," Vivian said. "You don't get clean hands, but you get something better than what Massimo has planned for you, which I think we both know isn't a long and comfortable future." Another silence. Then, "Why are you doing this?" Vivian thought about it honestly. "Because 2 people died in that warehouse, and I want the man responsible for it to spend the rest of his life in a federal prison. And because the fastest way to that outcome is you, whole and functional and telling the truth on a witness stand. Not you, destroyed and defensive, and providing Massimo's attorneys with material to discredit everything you say." She held Serena's gaze. "This isn't generosity, it's strategy. I want you to understand that." Serena nodded once, slowly. 8 o'clock tomorrow?" 8 o'clock. The meeting with Assistant U.S. Attorney Dana Reyes happened in a federal building conference room on Dearborn with 4 people in it. Reyes, her investigative partner, Roman, and Vivian, and then, an hour in, Serena, who arrived with her own attorney and a flash drive copy of everything in the personal backup account and the specific lockdown demeanor of a person who had decided to burn one life down in order to preserve another. Reyes was 47, trim, with the kind of face that gave nothing away and eyes that were absorbing everything simultaneously. She listened to Roman's presentation without interrupting, and she listened to the recording twice with her hands flat on the table and her expression not changing. And then she asked Serena 11 questions in a row that were so precisely targeted that Vivian understood she'd already known more about Massimo De Luca than they'd realized before they walked in the door. At the end of the questions, Reyes looked at the trust document and the wire transfer records and the shell company analysis and the Caulfield connection laid out in Roman's filing, and she said, "The divorce proceeding resumes tomorrow." "Yes," Roman said. "I'd like it to continue as scheduled." Reyes looked at Vivian. "I'd like Massimo De Luca in that courtroom tomorrow afternoon." Vivian understood immediately. "You want to move on him in a public venue. I want to move on him when his attorneys are occupied and he's in a location with federal court security already present and no advance knowledge of what's coming." Reyes leaned back slightly. "And I want to give him the experience of watching his case collapse in the proceeding he built to destroy you. That's not sentiment, it's strategic. A public arrest following a public evidentiary implosion limits his ability to manage narrative and gives us the strongest possible posture going into arraignment." Roman and Vivian looked at each other. Something passed between them that wasn't quite a smile, more the mutual recognition of people who had been holding something heavy for a long time and could finally see the place they were going to set it down. "What do you need from us?" Roman said. "Get Serena on that witness stand," Reyes said. "The rest is ours." The courtroom was room 14 of the Daily Center, which Vivian had been in 11 times over the course of the divorce proceedings, and had developed a specific and finely detailed relationship with. The way the afternoon light came through the high windows at an angle that made the air look thick, the particular acoustics that meant you could hear a whisper from across the gallery if the room was quiet, the smell of old wood and institutional carpet that was the smell of authority being performed rather than exercised. She sat at the defendant's table beside Roman, and she was very calm, which surprised her, given everything that had led to this room. Massimo was at the plaintiff's table 20 feet away. He was wearing the charcoal suit again, different shirt, same suit, and she thought with a detached clarity that was its own kind of strange gift that she knew this man's wardrobe as well as she knew her own, knew the specific way he carried himself when he was confident and the slightly different way he carried himself when he was performing confidence to cover something underneath. He was performing today. She could see it in the set of his shoulders, in the way his jaw was slightly tighter than it should have been. Something had made him uneasy. Maybe the change in Roman's energy. Maybe some intelligence from someone inside the system that Massimo maintained specifically to give him early warning. Maybe just the animal instinct of a predator who has been the predator long enough to recognize when the geometry of a room has shifted. He caught her eye once, briefly, when the court was settling before Caulfield entered. His expression said what it always said, that she was a problem he was in the process of solving, and that the solving was essentially complete. She held his gaze for exactly 3 seconds and then looked away, because she could afford to now. Caulfield entered and the room stood. Brandt called his first witness of the afternoon session, a psychiatrist named Kellner who had never met Vivian but had prepared a 70-page report on her behavioral patterns based on testimony from witnesses Massimo had selected. Kellner took the stand with the ease of a professional expert witness, the kind of man who testified for whoever could afford him and slept without difficulty. And Brandt walked him through his conclusions in the pleasant, methodical way of someone building a structure they were certain of. Roman cross-examined Kellner for 18 minutes, sufficiently thorough to establish inconsistencies in his methodology without revealing the full extent of what was coming. Vivian watched the jury. She watched Massimo's table. She watched the doors at the back of the courtroom. Brandt said, "The plaintiff calls Serena Voss." The room shifted slightly, the particular atmospheric change of a gallery becoming more attentive, because Serena's name had been in the city's social margins in relation to this case, and everyone in the room understood on some level what her presence at this hearing represented. Serena entered from the side door in a dark suit, her hair pulled back, and she took the oath and sat in the witness box with the posture of someone who had decided, fully and finally, and without remaining ambivalence, what she was going to do. Brandt approached her with the relaxed confidence of a man who had prepared this witness himself and knew exactly what she was going to say. "Ms. Voss, you served as legal advisor to the De Luca Group and to Massimo De Luca personally for approximately 2 years. Is that correct?" "That's correct." "And in that professional capacity, did you have occasion to observe Mrs. De Luca's behavior in professional and social settings?" Serena looked at Brandt. She looked at Massimo. Then she looked at Roman. "Yes," she said, "I did." "And would you characterize that behavior as—" "I need to make a statement," Serena said. Brandt stopped. "Ms. Voss, if you'll just answer the question, I need to make a statement," she said again, her voice clear and level and carrying to every corner of the room. "I cannot answer your question as framed because the answer you've prepared me to give is not the truth, and I'm not going to perjure myself in a federal court." The room detonated. Caulfield's gavel came down twice, 3 times, the sound sharp and futile against the eruption of the gallery. Brandt was on his feet. Massimo's hand, Vivian saw from across the room, had come down on the table with a force that moved his water glass 2 inches. His lead associate leaned toward him and said something rapid and urgent. Massimo's face had done something Vivian had never seen it do in 16 years. It had lost its control completely, just for a moment, just long enough, the mask dropping to show what was underneath, which was fury of the specific and concentrated kind that belongs to men who have never had to experience the consequence of their own actions and are experiencing it now for the first time. Roman was already on his feet. "Your Honor, the defense requests permission to examine this witness." Caulfield looked like a man watching his own house fall down. "This is highly irregular." "Your Honor," Roman said, and his voice had a quality that cut through the noise with the precision of something that had been aimed. "The defense has evidence material to these proceedings that the court has not yet seen. Given Ms. Voss's statement, we ask that the examination proceed." What happened next took 11 minutes and restructured everything. Roman approached the witness box. Serena sat with her hands in her lap and her spine straight and her eyes steady, and he asked her, in the specific and careful sequence they had constructed over 3 days, about her professional relationship with Massimo De Luca, about the document she had prepared and filed in his name, about a trust amendment dated November 2019, about a personal cloud backup account she maintained, about a file she had uploaded to that account 3 days after a warehouse fire on South Halsted Street in March of last year. The courtroom went quiet in the specific way of rooms where something irreversible is happening. Vivian was aware of Massimo at the periphery of her vision, aware without looking at him directly, the way you're aware of a fire without looking into it. "Ms. Voss," Roman said, "I'm going to ask you to listen to an audio file. I'd ask the court's permission to play this recording, which has been authenticated by a licensed digital forensics expert and marked as Defense Exhibit 31. Caulfield looked at Brandt. Brandt was on his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. The defense has not disclosed this exhibit in pre-trial." "The exhibit was obtained in the course of proceedings," Roman said calmly. "Under Rule 26, evidence obtained through discovery is admissible upon authentication, which has been provided. We have the authentication report for the court's review." Caulfield looked at the document Roman's assistant placed before him. He looked at it for a long moment. Whatever he was weighing in that moment, the risk of allowing it against the risk of what refusing it would look like in a record that he now understood was being scrutinized from directions he hadn't anticipated, the calculation didn't go the way Massimo needed it to go. "The exhibit will be allowed," Caulfield said. Roman nodded to his assistant. The courtroom's audio system activated. And then, in the flat and indifferent acoustics of Room 14 of the Daily Center, Massimo De Luca's voice filled the air. It was his voice unmistakably. The specific register of it, the Chicago inflection he'd never fully smoothed away, the particular cadence he used in private conversation when he wasn't performing for an audience. The recording had the ambient quality of a room being heard through a half-closed door. Not perfect audio, but clear enough, devastatingly clear. Every word arriving with the weight of something that had been locked away and was now free of every door that had been built to contain it. He talked about the warehouse. He talked about Tate and the accelerant schedule. He talked about the shift workers' timing as though their presence was a logistical variable he had already accounted for. He said the phrase acceptable cost in his own voice, in his own cadence, and the woman in the front row of the gallery pressed her hand to her mouth. He talked about Caulfield. He said the judge's name with the casual familiarity of someone referring to a piece of equipment they owned. 4 minutes and 11 seconds. Then silence. The room didn't explode this time. It went very still, which was worse. The stillness of a large number of people processing something that had rearranged what they thought they knew about the world they were sitting in. Massimo was standing. Vivienne saw it without looking at him directly. The peripheral awareness of sudden movement, the sound of his chair going back. Brandt was grabbing his arm. The associate was on her feet. Massimo's face was the face of a man who had built his entire adult life on the belief that he was the one who controlled rooms, who controlled information, who controlled outcomes, and who was now standing in a room he did not control, receiving information he could not manage, confronting an outcome he had not prepared for. And the specific violence of that confrontation was visible in every line of him. He looked across the courtroom at Vivienne. She looked back. She didn't look away. She held his gaze across 20 feet of courtroom air, and she did not give him anything. Not fear, not satisfaction, not the particular pain he'd put in her chest the night she watched the silver Mercedes go north. She gave him nothing because she didn't owe him anything anymore, and she wanted him to know it. He took 2 steps toward her. One of his own security-cleared associates moved to intercept, but Massimo had a hand out, pushing past, and his face was doing something she had genuinely never seen it do. It was losing its architecture completely, the careful structure of Massimo De Luca, the respected businessman and devoted husband, dissolving in real time under the pressure of what was collapsing around him. "Vivienne," his voice was different, raw in a way it had never been in 16 years of marriage. "You have no idea what you've—" The doors at the back of the courtroom opened. 4 federal agents came through first, in the particular purposeful movement of people who have timed their entry to a specific moment and have arrived at that moment precisely. Behind them, Dana Reyes in a dark coat, with the measured pace of a woman who had done this before and understood that the performance of authority was as important as its exercise. 2 Cook County marshals materialized from the side door, flanking Caulfield's position, which caused the judge to go very still in a way that told Vivienne he understood immediately what their presence beside him meant. Reyes walked to the center of the courtroom floor. She held up her identification. "Massimo De Luca," she said, and her voice carried the room without effort. "You are under arrest on federal charges including conspiracy to commit arson, wire fraud, insurance fraud, obstruction of justice, and 2 counts of second-degree murder in connection with the Kellerman Industrial Storage Fire of March 14th. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. Massimo didn't move for 3 seconds. 3 seconds in which the room held itself completely still, in which the only sound was Reyes's voice completing the advisement of rights in its flat, procedural cadence. Then one of the federal agents moved to his side and took his arm, and Massimo De Luca, who had controlled this city for 20 years, who had owned judges and politicians and police captains, who had built an empire on fear and precision and the specific genius of a man who understood how systems could be bent, allowed himself to be walked toward the back of the courtroom with his hands being drawn behind him. He passed within 8 feet of Vivian's table. She didn't look up. She heard his footsteps, the specific sound of his shoes on the courtroom floor, the rhythm she'd heard 1,000 times in marble foyers and hotel ballrooms, and the private rooms where decisions were made, and she kept her eyes on the table in front of her, on the yellow legal pad and the pen, and the cup of water that Roman's assistant had placed there an hour ago. She heard the sound of the doors, the brief eruption of noise from the corridor as the press registered what was happening, and then the doors closed again, and it was quieter. Roman put his hand briefly on the table beside hers, not touching, just near. She understood it. At the plaintiff's table, Brandt was on his phone, his face gray. Massimo's associate was gathering documents with the mechanical efficiency of someone doing the only task they could do in a situation that had exceeded all preparation. The gallery was beginning to find its voice, the accumulated noise of 300 people processing an irreversible event, the specific human sound of a world rearranging itself around a new fact. Vivian became aware gradually that her hands were shaking, not visibly. She had them flat on the table and the shaking was internal, a deep physical tremor that had been running under everything for weeks, and was only now, in the sudden release of what she'd been holding, making itself known at the surface. She pressed her palms harder against the table. Then Reyes was beside her, and she said something to Roman in a low voice, and Roman nodded. And Reyes looked at Vivian with the directness of a woman who had spent her career looking at people in moments that had cost them everything. "We have Caulfield," she said quietly. "The marshals are executing the warrant right now. His clerk has already agreed to cooperate." A pause. "We also have Drucker, the building inspector. He contacted our office an hour ago through his own attorney." Vivian looked up at her. "Serena?" "She'll come in tomorrow morning to complete her formal statement. The cooperation agreement terms are what Mr. Mercer negotiated." Reyes held her gaze. "You should know. When we pulled Massimo's phone records as part of the warrant execution, we found a call made 4 days ago to a number associated with a private security firm. The call lasted 6 minutes. We believe it relates to the surveillance on Ms. Voss and possibly to the search of your motel room in Pilsen." Vivian processed this. He knew we were moving. He suspected. He didn't know fast enough. Reyes paused. "Mrs. De Luca, I want to be direct with you about what comes next. Federal proceedings are slow, and they are not easy for witnesses, and the media attention on this case is going to be significant and sustained. What you've done here today was necessary, and it was right, but it's also only the beginning of a longer process." "I know," Vivian said. "Do you have somewhere safe to stay?" Roman answered before she could. "She does?" Reyes nodded. She looked at Vivian for another moment. The look of one woman to another across the space of what the day had cost, and what it had changed, and what was still left to do. And then she turned and walked back toward the federal agents moving through the courtroom, because there was more work to be done, and Dana Reyes was a woman who did her work. The gallery was fully noisy now, the press already moving for the exits, the story breaking in real time across every platform that covered the city. Vivian could hear it distantly, the rush of information finding its channels, the story of Massimo De Luca beginning its transformation from the story he had written about himself to the one that was true. Roman sat beside her. He didn't say anything for a moment. The courtroom was emptying around them. The bailiffs directing people out, Brandt and his associate gone, Caulfield's bench empty, the afternoon light still coming through the high windows at the same angle it always had, indifferent to what had happened beneath it. "How are you?" Roman said finally. Vivian thought about it. Her hands had stopped shaking. The deep tremor had quieted into something else. Not peace, not yet. The distance to peace was still considerable, but a stillness, the particular stillness of a body that has been running hard for weeks and has finally been allowed to stop for a moment before it starts again. "I'm not sure yet," she said. It was honest. Roman nodded, accepting it. Outside the Daily Center, the November city was doing what it did. Moving, grinding, indifferent and magnificent, the lake wind coming off the water and pressing against everything that had the nerve to stand up in it. Somewhere in the federal building on Dearborn, Massimo De Luca was being processed into a system he had spent 20 years purchasing influence over, and discovering that 20 years of purchased influence had a specific and unforgiving limit, and that he had reached it today in room 14 while his own voice played over a courtroom audio system and gave him nothing to say in his own defense, because the voice saying the things was already his and had always been his, and there was no distance he could put between himself and it now. Vivian stood on those courthouse steps with the wind in her face and Roman beside her, and the city spread out in every direction, and she felt for the first time in weeks the specific sensation of cold air entering her lungs without the weight of dread riding underneath it. Just cold air. Just Chicago doing what Chicago did. Her phone buzzed. She looked at it. A text from a number she didn't recognize. 5 words. "I heard it. I'm sorry." She didn't know who had sent it, and it didn't matter. She put the phone back in her pocket. Roman said, "There's going to be a press statement needed. Not today, but soon." "I know. And the estate proceedings are going to be complicated. The fraudulent trust amendment, the shell companies, the asset recovery. It's going to take time." "I know that too." He looked at her sideways. "You're very calm." "I'm exhausted," she said. Calm and exhausted looked the same from the outside. He almost smiled. "What do you need right now?" She thought about it. The wind moved through the plaza, scattering the last of the autumn leaves across the concrete, and the city's noise rose and fell around them in its perpetual rhythm, and Vivian De Luca stood in the middle of it with everything she'd built and lost and fought for, arranged around her like the aftermath of something enormous, and she thought about what she needed. "I need to go back to Cora's," she said. Roman looked at her. "The diner. I told Cora I'd cover the dinner shift." A pause. "I'm not going to call in." He was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded, understanding something about this that didn't require explanation. That the woman who had just watched her husband arrested in a federal courtroom needed, before anything else, the specific gravity of ordinary work, the weight of plates and coffee cups, and the griddle's noise and Cora's unsentimental company. "I'll drive you," he said. They walked down the courthouse steps into the city. Behind them, the Daily Center stood against the gray November sky, solid and procedural and unchanged, as though the last 6 hours had been entirely routine. Ahead of them, the city moved and breathed and demanded nothing from either of them except their continued presence in it, which was, Vivian thought, exactly enough for right now. Tomorrow, the real work would begin again. But tonight, she had a dinner shift to cover, and the griddle needed cleaning and Cora would be short-handed without her, and those 3 facts were, in this particular moment, the most stabilizing things she knew. The dinner shift at Cora's ran until 10. Vivian worked it the way she'd worked every shift in the past 6 weeks, methodically, without complaint, her body moving through the choreography of the job while her mind did other things in the background. The regulars came in. The construction crew from the Halstead project took the corner booth and ordered the same thing they always ordered. A young woman sat alone at the counter for 2 hours nursing coffee and reading something on her phone, and Vivian refilled her cup 3 times without being asked, because she recognized the posture of someone who needed to be somewhere that wasn't where they lived and didn't need to be talked to about it. Cora was behind the counter when the late news came on the small television mounted in the corner above the pie case. The chyron read, "Chicago Mafia Boss, Arrested in Federal Courtroom," and there was footage of the Daily Center exterior, the federal agents moving through the plaza, a brief shot of the back of a man in a charcoal suit being walked toward a vehicle that Vivian recognized without needing to see his face. Cora watched it for a moment. Then she looked at Vivian, who was wiping down the counter and not looking at the television. Vivi, Cora said. I know. A pause. That's your husband. My estranged husband. She kept wiping. Was my estranged husband. Cora was quiet for a long time. The news moved on to something else. The construction crew in the corner booth was arguing about a football game, loud and cheerful, and completely indifferent to anything outside their own evening. Cora reached under the counter and produced a bottle of bourbon that she kept there for reasons she'd never explained, and poured 2 fingers into a coffee mug and set it in front of Vivian. Go home, Cora said. I'll close. Vivian looked at the bourbon. She looked at Cora's face, which was doing the thing it did when it was being kind without performing kindness. She picked up the mug and drank half of it and set it back down. Thank you, she said. For what? For not asking questions the first day I walked in here. Cora looked at her with the frank, unsentimental gaze of a woman who had seen 61 years of people walking through her door, carrying things they hadn't figured out how to put down yet. I ask plenty of questions, she said. I just know which ones to keep to myself. She picked up a rag and turned back to the counter. Go home, Vivi. Vivian went home. She sat in the Bridgeport apartment on the futon with the remaining bourbon in the mug and the prepaid phone and the encrypted drive on the table in front of her and the city doing its night business outside the window. And she let herself be still in a way she hadn't been since before the Beaumont Gala. She didn't think about tomorrow's press. She didn't think about the federal proceedings or the estate case or Serena Voss's cooperation agreement or the names of the 2 workers who had died in Kellerman Industrial Storage and whose families she had already, through Roman's office, made discreet preliminary contact with regarding civil recovery. She thought about all of it in the way you think about things you can't act on in the immediate moment, aware of them, holding them, but not fighting with them tonight. She slept for 7 hours, which was the longest she'd slept in 2 months. The federal case against Massimo De Luca moved with the particular momentum of a prosecution that had been built carefully before the arrest and was now running on its own structural weight. Dana Reyes was methodical and relentless in the way of federal prosecutors who understood that the size and visibility of a case was proportional to the precision it required. Every charge documented, every piece of evidence authenticated, every witness prepared with the thoroughness of someone who understood that Massimo's defense team would spend millions trying to find the crack in the foundation. There were 7 defendants total by the time the indictment was finalized 3 weeks after the courthouse arrest. Massimo. Judge Warren Caulfield, who was taken into custody the same afternoon as Massimo, and who, within 48 hours, had retained separate counsel and begun a process of negotiating his own cooperation that Reyes described to Roman as predictable. The building inspector Drucker, who had already come in voluntarily and whose cooperation, combined with Serena's, created an evidentiary picture of the Kellerman fire that left no meaningful space for reasonable doubt. 2 members of Massimo's financial team who had managed the Halcyon and Blue Meridian transactions. Gerald Payne, the attorney who had served the fraudulent restraining order in Vivian's foyer, not for the TRO itself, which had been Caulfield's corruption to answer for, but for his documented role in preparing and filing the fraudulent trust amendment, which Reyes had added to the indictment with the specific and deliberate intention of making clear that everyone who had participated in dismantling Vivian's life had a charge with their name on it. Serena Voss was not among the 7 defendants. Her cooperation agreement gave her immunity from federal prosecution in exchange for full testimony and the complete contents of her personal backup account. She would face a separate disciplinary proceeding from the Illinois bar, which Roman estimated would result in a suspension of not less than 3 years and not more than permanent disbarment, depending on the panel. She had accepted this. She had accepted it, Vivian thought, the way people accept the cost of things they should have done differently earlier. Not gracefully, but without the energy to pretend the accounting was unfair. Vivian testified before the federal grand jury on a Tuesday in December, 7 weeks after the arrest. She wore the gray resale suit again because she had worn it on the day everything changed, and she was not superstitious, but she was precise about the things that had worked and saw no reason to alter them. She sat in the grand jury room and answered every question Reyes put to her without hesitation and without embellishment, because the truth was sufficient, and she had learned in the past 2 months that the truth handled properly was a more powerful instrument than anything built on top of it. When it was done, Reyes walked her to the elevator and said, "You did well in there." "I told the truth," Vivian said. "That's not a skill." "You'd be surprised," Reyes said, and the elevator came. The civil proceedings, the estate case, the asset recovery, the unwinding of the fraudulent trust amendment, and the shell company structures took 14 months. Roman had warned her it would take at least that long, and he'd been right, and there had been days in those 14 months that were harder in some ways than the weeks in Pilsen and Bridgeport, because the grinding procedural work of recovering what had been taken from her required a different kind of endurance than the crisis had. Crisis had its own energy. The adrenaline of clear and present threat, the focus that comes when the options have narrowed to one. The civil proceedings were the opposite. Slow, paperwork dense, arguable at every point, requiring her to maintain a quality of sustained attention and patience that was more exhausting, in some ways, than running. But Roman was thorough, and the evidence of the fraudulent trust amendment was unambiguous. And the Cook County courts, operating now without Warren Caulfield, who had been replaced by a judge who had no relationship with the DeLuca organization, ruled in her favor on every material point. The fraudulent amendment was voided. The asset freeze was lifted. The Halcyon and Blue Meridian holdings, once their fraudulent purpose was established, became subject to civil forfeiture proceedings that ultimately returned a significant portion of their value to the estate. By the time the civil case concluded, Vivian was entitled to 51% of the DeLuca Group's legitimate holdings, the real estate portfolio, 3 operating businesses, and a portfolio of investments that had been built, in significant part, on her own labor over 16 years. The additional 1% over the standard marital division was Roman's idea, and the judge had agreed with his legal reasoning, and Vivian had not objected. She moved back into the North Shore mansion for exactly 3 days. She walked through it once the first morning, the same way she'd walked through it the day she left, room by room, this time without the weight of departure. And she understood on the second morning that she didn't want to live there. The house was beautiful and large and full of 16 years of architecture she no longer needed to inhabit. She listed it with a real estate firm on the 3rd day and was back in a rental in Lincoln Square by the end of the week, in an apartment that had good light and a kitchen that worked and no ghosts arranged in its corners waiting to be acknowledged. The DeLuca Group's executive team was a different matter. There were 11 senior executives. 4 of them had documented involvement in the criminal operation, not at the level of criminal liability in most cases, but at the level of willful ignorance that is its own kind of complicity, the kind practiced by people who understand that not asking questions is a form of participation. Vivian removed all 4 within her first month as controlling owner through board processes that were procedurally clean and publicly explained in terms of the company's new governance standards. The remaining 7 she met with individually. She told each of them, in the same flat and direct terms she used for everything now, that the company they worked for was going to operate differently going forward, that she expected that transition to be difficult, and that the ones who couldn't make it would be treated fairly, and the ones who could would be part of something that was worth being part of. 3 of the 7 left within 6 months. The other 4 stayed, and 2 of them turned out to be better than she'd expected, which was the kind of surprise that she'd stopped being surprised by. The specific discovery that people who had been operating inside a corrupt system were sometimes not themselves corrupt, just contained, and that removing the containment changed what they were capable of. She hired a CEO. She was not interested in running the company day to day. She was interested in what the company could be made into, which was a different kind of work. And she kept herself at the level of board chair and strategic director and let the operational machinery be managed by people whose specific skills were better suited to it than hers. What she kept for herself was the foundation. It had started as an idea on a Tuesday afternoon in Bridgeport, in the back apartment with the bad lock and the futon and the water stain above the window, when she'd been sitting at the folding table at 2 a.m. reading the article about herself in the City magazine and thinking about the specific machinery that had been turned against her, and how different her situation would have been if she'd had no resources and no Roman Mercer and no 8 years of quietly kept receipts. She'd written 3 words in the margin of her yellow legal pad. What comes next? She'd circled them and left them there and not gone back to them until the civil case was finished, and she had the resources to do something other than survive. The Hale Foundation. She used her birth name, the one she'd had before she became a DeLuca, opened its offices on a Wednesday morning in a renovated space in the West Loop that had been a printing company for 30 years and had the original concrete floors and the smell of old industrial work that she found she liked, that felt like the right environment for the kind of work she intended to do. The foundation's mandate was specific: legal and financial assistance for women leaving situations of domestic financial abuse. Not just physical danger, but the particular and often invisible form of control that operated through money and legal structures and institutional access, the kind that left no marks but cost everything. Roman joined the foundation's board. Cora, when Vivian asked her, said she didn't do boards, but she'd come to the opening. She did come to the opening, wearing a dress that Vivian suspected she'd bought specifically for the occasion and would never admit to. And she stood in the middle of the West Loop office with her coffee and looked around at the space and said, "Nice floors." "Thank you," Vivian said. "You going to be okay?" Cora asked. Not warmly, not with performance, just directly, the way Cora did everything. Vivian thought about it honestly. "I think so," she said. "I think that's the most accurate thing I can say." Cora nodded. "Good enough," she said, and drank her coffee. The federal trial of Massimo DeLuca began on a March morning, 14 months after the courthouse arrest, in the Dirksen Federal Building on South Dearborn. Vivian attended the first day and the last day, and several days in between, not because she was required to, but because she had decided that she was going to be present for what she had set in motion, that she owed that witness to the two men who had died in Kellerman Industrial Storage, and whose names she now knew by heart. Marcus Webb, 34, who had been a father of two and had been trying to save enough to move his family out of the South Side neighborhood where they'd been for 3 generations. Darnell Pruitt, 26, who had been 3 months away from finishing a welding certification program at a community college when the night shift on March 14th ended in a way the fire investigators' falsified report spent considerable effort attributing to structural failure. She had met their families the previous autumn through a process that had been arranged carefully by an intermediary so that the meetings couldn't be construed as witness interference. She had sat in a living room in Bronzeville with Marcus Webb's wife, a woman named Adrienne who was 32 and working 2 jobs, and raising their children with the specific and exhausted grace of someone who has had no other option. And she had said what she'd come to say, that she was sorry, that what had happened to Marcus had happened because a man had made a calculation that his life was worth less than $12 million, and that she was going to spend whatever of her own resources were necessary to ensure that the civil case against the DeLuca estate provided Adrienne and her children with the financial stability that had been taken from them. Adrienne had looked at her for a long moment. "Are you doing this because you feel guilty?" she'd said. Not hostile, genuinely asking. Vivian had thought about it. "I'm doing it because it's right," she said. "But yes, also partly because I feel guilty. I was married to him for 16 years and I didn't know what he was. That's not the same as responsibility, but it's also not nothing." Adrienne had nodded slowly. "At least you're honest about it," she said. The civil settlement reached with both families was substantial, funded through the asset recovery from the Blue Meridian and Halcyon dissolution, and structured so that it was guaranteed regardless of the outcome of the criminal trial, because Vivian was not going to let Marcus Webb's children's financial security depend on a verdict. The verdict came on a Thursday in May, after 6 days of jury deliberation. Vivian was in the courtroom when the 4-person stood and read it. Guilty on all federal counts, including the 2 murder charges that Reyes had pursued with the specific and sustained ferocity of a prosecutor who understood that insurance fraud and arson were the headline, but that the 2 men who had died were the point. Massimo sat at the defense table and received each count with the stillness of a man who has run out of responses, who has been through 14 months of proceedings and watched everything he built disassembled piece by piece in a public forum, and who is now sitting with the weight of what that disassembly has revealed about what he actually was underneath all of it. He did not look at Vivian, not once during the verdict reading. She had expected to feel something specific when the verdicts came: relief, or satisfaction, or something that partook of the wound that had opened in her the night of the Beaumont Gala. What she felt instead was quieter than any of those things. It was the feeling of a door closing. Not slamming, not the dramatic finality of a moment in a film, just closing, gently and completely, the soft click of a latch settling into its housing, and the particular silence that follows it. Sentencing came 8 weeks later. 43 years, federal, no parole eligibility until year 30 on the murder counts. Warren Caulfield received 12 years following his cooperation agreement. Drucker received 4. Gerald Payne, whose attorney had argued strenuously for minimal involvement, received 18 months and permanent disbarment. The financial team members received sentences proportional to their roles.